Hey everyone, welcome to the very first episode of the Talking Pictures podcast. I'm Dan Lefebvre, and with me is my good friend, Brian Collins. Say hi, Brian.
Hi, Brian. Hey, everybody. How's it going?
So the movie that we're going to be covering is Mad Max Fury Road. And since this is the first episode, we have a category wheel, and we've already spun that, and it landed on cinematography. So before we begin, let's set up some expectations. What do you mean when you when you hear the word cinematography? Can you kind of define that for us, Brian? What are we going to be talking about here?
Well, yeah, I can define sort of the way I see it. There are two main parts, I think, to cinematography. There's the practical, positioning of the camera, the choosing of the format and the lenses, and trying to deliver what the director's vision of the film is. And then I think there's a higher level idea of cinematography that's connected to, producer level or director level, where you have the vision of what the shots are going to do, convey narrative information or create a feeling, and that can be something that is carried throughout the entire film. And it's a little bit separate from, the practical side of it. The practical side of the cinematographer's job is to bring about that vision. And so I think I try and look at them in those ways. What's the overall vision, and how do they utilize the shots to tell the story in the narrative film? And then how is that carried out by the crew and the DP?
So it almost sounds like there's two sides. There's the technical side of what cameras there are, what lenses, everything as far as that, but also the more nebulous or the less concrete side, the more abstract side, which is trying to get that vision out of the director's head, in this case, George Miller, trying to get that vision out of George Miller's head and then actually make that into a tangible something that you can see.
Right, yeah, and I think that this movie that you've chosen is a perfect example of this, because the DP on it, John Seal, has done extensive interviews about what it was like working with George Miller, how he didn't have a script, how he had to work from storyboards, and it's really listening to his stories and some of the other people who worked on the film. It's really interesting seeing how they had to take his vision and literally just the storyboards and translate those visually for the movie. And I think that's a perfect example of the definition that I just gave of looking at this film in that way.
Now, I want to get to that because John Seal is an interesting pick, and I have a comment about that. But kind of going back as far as the movie that I picked, I did pick this movie, but I know. Just because I know you, Brian, I know you were really excited when this movie came out. So kind of set some of the expectations as far as or setting the scenario as far as our history with this film. I can't remember. Did you see it multiple times in the theater?
Yeah.
Because I only saw it once in the theater. And then I saw it a few times when I was, preparing for this episode. But you saw it multiple times in the theater, correct?
Yeah, I think I saw it at least two times. Yeah, I was super stoked about it. Yeah, I knew it was going to be really, really big because you could just tell from the trailer. And I knew a little bit. I'd watched as a kid. I'd watched the Mad Max movie, so I was a fan. And I knew that this movie had been a long time coming, that he had worked on it for, I think, almost a decade or more. So to be able to see that the fruition of something like that's been sort of put on hold for a while, but still maintaining that enthusiasm by the writer, the director, and everyone else who was a part of it is always makes it exciting for me. So yeah, I saw it a couple of times, and I remember that I wrote an article about the color grading on it, which I found really, really interesting. But aside from that, I didn't really go much into other just my own personal observation of the cinematography itself until we got to looking at it for this episode of the podcast. And I found that equally, if not more, fascinating how Miller had developed this look and the theory that he was using behind it. and how the DP of John Seale sort of took that and transformed it.
Yeah. And John Seale, I thought he was kind of an interesting pick for George Miller because, like you said, there's other Mad Max movies that are just classics, and I'll be completely honest, I haven't seen the other Mad Max movies, so it would be interesting to kind of hear your perspective from, somebody who's been a fan of the franchise, and then Fury Road was the first one that I've seen. But John Seale was an interesting pick because he didn't work on any of the other Mad Max films.
Right.
I'm looking at his history. He's worked on some massive films, so Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Poseidon. He did another one that's very kind of epic in the desert, that Prince of Persia, Sands of Time. But it's kind of interesting to, I don't know, you have other directors of photography who are the guys in charge of cinematography. You have people that have worked on the previous films. Why do you think that you wouldn't go back to one of those, or was it maybe it could have just been wasn't available at the time, they were already working on another project? It could be something as simple as that.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the history behind the change. There was actually a change. I know that because John Seale talked about it in a couple of those videos I watched of him in an interview, where he came on this thing sort of late. The original DP that was on it left for some reason. He didn't specify. It wasn't for grievances or anything like that. I think he just left for some reason. So Seale came on, and he's sort of behind the eight ball at first. And what was also interesting was that this was the first, I think his first foray into 3D, and he didn't have a lot of experience with digital photography because he's kind of an old school cinematographer, so he's used to working on film and that kind of thing. So that was really interesting. So I'm not sure what he had worked with Miller before, like you said, but I'm not sure why Miller picked him specifically. It sounded like to me that he wanted someone that he could really count on, who was a really great craftsman, who knew how to run a team. Because, as I said, they weren't really given a script. They were just given like 3,500 images on a storyboard, and they were told to, go out into the Namibian desert and shoot all of these. So I think it was less, not that, John Seale isn't a talented person, but he was probably someone that Miller felt could really pull this off, because you've got to stand the heat, you've got to stand the time that you're going to be there, you've got to work in a really incredible and difficult conditions. So maybe it was that Seale brought that sort of assurance and competency mixed with his vast experience.
Now, I'm going to throw a curveball because I'm just curious. I have no idea what the answer to this is, but do you know if in the previous Mad Max films was it similar to that, where George Miller didn't have a script and he just worked off of a storyboard, or was this the first time?
I'm not really sure about that either. It wouldn't surprise me if he used storyboards like that in a similar way. Nothing that Seale said about him seemed to come to a surprise to him. He stressed specific things about Miller, like the enormous amount of time and detail he puts into editing. He also mentioned the fact that he was very adamant about this sort of let's fix it in post sort of thing. So John Seale was sort of like, I felt like there were times when I didn't know why I was there, because it was like I had a crew and they had basically one main mandate, which was keep the crosshairs in the center of the screen of the action, and and follow the shooting script, follow those images.
Yeah.
But
all right,
I'm not
so
sure.
No, I have no idea either. I mean, that's just something that was curious to me, because that's not that common. Usually you have a script, right?
Right. Yeah.
All right, so let's go ahead and let's talk about the cinematography. I'd like to start, and basically what I've done, just kind of as a little setting up here, I've gone through and I've watched the movie and I've set certain points that I think would be great to chat about, and nothing better than starting it off about 1 minute and 10 seconds into the film when Max is introduced. Max, of course, Tom Hardy's character. there's a lot of huge establishing shots, and just right away it sets up that whole vast nothingness of the desert, and just it really just it sets the world right away. Like all of a sudden there's nothing else around. You see him, he's just kind of got his car off to the left, his really nicely framed shot.
It's beautiful.
There's nobody else there. What do you think as far as the way cinematography can be used to help transport somebody to another world? I know kind of traditionally you're going to have your establishing shot and that aspect here. And so is this kind of the establishing shot of the entire film to just set up the world? Or because it's already an established franchise, do they even need to do that? Do you just assume that most people are kind of like you, where you've seen all the other ones, or you at least kind of know the premise?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm trying to think back to some of the earlier films in the franchise, and it seems like I could be wrong about this, but it probably is the case that he starts off with a shot of Mad Max every time. It wouldn't surprise me.
Oh, that makes
sense. I have to go back
and
confirm that. But yeah, I think that first shot, which is it's just gorgeous, right? You center in on who this is. Everybody, most people, know who this is when they see it because it's accompanied by the voiceover. You see him, the main figure, in the center. You see the vast wasteland in the background. And you sort of connect what's being said about him and his past. And this, he's the one who runs from the dead and the living. And you connect that character. And it's sort of, I think it's very, very quick. And it doesn't need to be very long because Miller just jumps right into it, right? We know who this is and we know what kind of character he is. So other than just getting a gorgeous shot of his car and him, I think that's mainly what it does. It just sort of gets people into it and say, this is Mad Max. This is what he looks like. This is where he is. It's the same thing. It's almost a genre in itself. You know that there are going to be car chases. There are going to be incredible stunts, and it's just like, let's go, hit the gas.
Yeah, definitely. Not only that, I think kind of something that I saw from seeing this for the first time, I kind of knew the premise of, Mad Max from the other movies, but that very opening shot, kind of what it told me was the desert is more than just where they're at. It's like when there's that little two-headed lizard that kind of crawls and then he stomps on it and he eats it. There's that, and then, the next shot, I think he's chased, and there's you see sand flying everywhere. It just tells you right away, or at least it told me right away, that the desert is almost another character in and of itself in the film. This vast area that these people have to survive in. And I think you said in the intro it was filmed in Namibia, which is geography, it's the southwestern coast of Africa, right, just above South Africa. So like utter nothingness. Right. And I think it's something that's kind of unique. There's not a lot of films that the environment is an actual character in and of itself, or maybe I'm just thinking way too much into it, but no. it seems like that to me, where the character is almost, the environment is almost a villain, right? I mean, because it's just so harsh and unforgiving.
Right. No, I don't think you read too much into it. I mean, Miller is someone who, in that specific, when he deals with the environment, he's just sort of a list of other classical Hollywood directors, not to pigeonhole him in that category, but he does use some stylistic techniques that harken back to that. And a lot of times directors like John Ford are shown to use the background, the environment, the old West, as its own character, to give a sense of vastness, a sense of independence to the characters, that I think is what you're describing. So there's like a history of that Miller's using, I think, in this film and in the rest of them in the franchise. It certainly is its own character and creates much of the mood for all of these films.
Yeah, that's interesting. With John Ford, I never even thought about comparing this to Westerns. I mean, it makes sense, but for some reason I just never thought about it. 'Cause, I mean, kind of a post-apocalyptic world, and which to me is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. That's kind of, I think of that as like being way off in the future, whereas Westerns are like way off in the past. And I know that's wrong necessarily, right? Because there's areas of the world that are that way, obviously, Namibia being where they shot it. But just, I don't know, that's just kind of the general idea that I have in my head for one reason or another.
Yeah, I think you could draw a lot of connections between the Hollywood Western genre and what Miller's doing here when it comes to Mad Max himself. Is sort of, you look at something like Clint Eastwood's The Man with No Name, or the Spaghetti Westerns, or something where you have an anti-hero who does good things but not necessarily for the right reasons, right? And you have this sort of tortured soul who's going up against social institutions that have been corrupted. You've got the downfall of civilization, basically in the Mad Max movies, and he is the person who's trying to live within it. He's sort of the everyman, who won't give up,
doing whatever it takes. It might not always be something that we would think of as good in our current civilization, but just knowing that, once again, kind of the desert being a villain, right? I mean, he's doing whatever he has to do to survive against that villain.
Yeah, and like I said, you can go back and watch some John Ford movies, and you'll start to see that how he intentionally uses the background. I think that's what you're seeing. Yeah. I think it's also interesting to point out that one of the main stylistic features of this film and Miller's approach to cinematography that I learned from John Seale was this sort of centering aesthetic, where he continually said that Miller kept yelling at the cameraman and everyone, keep the crosshairs on their noses, keep the crosshairs on their noses, on Charlene's nose, right? Don't
Which isn't
put it
usual.
off to the
Usually
side.
you don't do that. Yeah.
Right. Which, it sort of goes against, as he was saying, a lot of what they're taught with the 2/3 rule, and maybe trying to show some background images of what's going on. And he said he was just adamant about it, put everything in the center. And I think there was the theory is that he wanted to have a very, very short editing average time cut. I think it was like 1.8 seconds is the average editing on this. So the cinematography decisions, I think, were heavily influenced by what he wanted to do with the editing. And I think that's an important point.
Once again, kind of fixing it in post, like you said before,
Right, because his idea was that if you get people to focus on the action that's happening in the center, they won't, for one thing, they won't notice any incontinuities or any, CG problems in the peripheral if they're focused on the characters and the action. Plus, it will help with that quick editing style. It's really going to help people maintain their understanding of what's going on. I've seen this in a couple of articles I've read, who's referencing chaos film, right? These sort of the big action blockbusters that we see in Transformers, or we see movies like Paul Greengrass, who does, incredibly quick cuts. I think that Miller wanted to bring that kind of pace to this movie, but not the confusion and the problems that he saw with the other forms. And, personally, I agree with that. I can't, it sort of gets me disoriented when I watch those action films like Transformers. And
well, Paul Greengrass does the Bourne movies, right, where it's very shaky handheld, and you can kind of tell what's going on when they fight, but you only kind of tell once it stops and there's one person that's alive and the other one's not, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of people don't, some people like that, a lot of people don't like that because, I don't know, for various reasons. Maybe it makes them sick. Maybe they just, they stop understanding what exactly is going on. And it seems, I see that it's kind of becomes gratuitous. Like, let's just make a bunch of cuts because we can, and we're going to feed in action and energy through that. But I think that what this movie shows in his approach to cinematography and this sort of centering thing, the centering aesthetic, is that he can keep your eye focused where it needs to be and then cut at that rapid pace, and you still can comprehend what's going on with the characters and the action. And I think it's a great example of a compromise between that. Someone who's thought about this a lot and worked it out to where he wants the story not to get lost in the action, but he wants the action to drive the story.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious. Talking about kind of centering, I'm curious about the next kind of sequence that I had was about 3 minutes in where Max gets captured and then he's being tattooed, and one of the war boys holds up a branding iron to the camera, and it's centered right there, right? But I'm curious to hear your thoughts, because to me, and when I first saw it, I think I'm pretty sure I saw it in 3D if I remember right, and this type of effect just it seemed to be really popular in 2015, and kind of real, just throw an object right up close to the audience and play up that 3D effect, where you just push something right into the audience. And I was almost disappointed when I saw that, because I didn't really expect that from this type of movie, and maybe that wasn't what it was intended to be, but that was kind of how I read it.
I don't know. I'm not sure about that. I mean, I'm just going off by what I learned from John Seale's talks. And, when he came on, they had been in development to shoot this as a 3D movie, and they were having all kinds of problems. But they were working with people who were developing these different types of 3D cameras, and there were lots of problems, to work through, because it was still very early, again, in its resurgence and popularity. But then he said one day, Miller came in, they had a meeting, and he said, we're not going to do 3D. We're going to do 2D. And he said, so what are we going to do, John? John said, I had no idea what to say. So he said, I work with Panavision. And I said, what does Panavision use? And somebody said, they use Alexas. We're going to use Alexas, George, on the film. So he had to go through that. So I think at that point, they had made that decision aesthetically to just go ahead and shoot it in 2D. I'm not sure if that, a scene like that, where I get your point, we're sort of coming at the screen.
Right, yeah. I think of the birds effect, right, where you just have birds flying in or something.
Yeah, right. It seems a little unmotivated and gratuitous.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that maybe it could have been a leftover shot from that intentional 3D rendering that they were going to do, but I think it works with the whole centering aesthetic of it. Plus, it puts you in Max's place, and there are a lot of sort of point of view handheld shots that come from a character like Mad Max or Furiosa or others that I think that they use. For example, some of these I'm just watching, like that intro part again. There are a lot of shots where of that, I guess it's his daughter or that young girl who's constantly haunting him, and they do these cut scenes to her, and it's sort of jarring and scary. I mean, they're putting us in the mind of his, So I think that there's a lot of that going on.
Yeah, well, even kind of the next sequence that I had, we have some of that too, and that's when Immortan Joe is introduced. He's, of course, the main villain, other than the desert character that I just kind of created. But when you see Immortan Joe, something that really struck me with the cinematography here is something that you were alluding to, where you kind of see it from their perspective, and you have two different shots, right, of Immortan Joe. You never really see him straight on here. You're either seeing over his shoulder, where he's looking down on people. He's their ruler, right? So he's up above them, or you're from down below, and you're looking up from the peasant's point of view. I think there's even an old guy who kind of brings a pair of binoculars to look up, and you see through that guy's perspective, right, of what Immortan Joe must look like. And not only that, but it also kind of adds to, this guy's been here before, he knows to bring a pair of binoculars.
Right.
But just the way the cinematography really helped to pull that, as this guy is not only their leader, but he's basically a dictator. He's their ruler, or as he says, their redeemer, right?
Right. And you're not sure, why they sort of hold him in this high esteem, to dress him and do these things. But then you realize that he's the holder of the water, and he's the breeder of the war boys or whatever. And but he's also a harsh tyrant because
Yeah.
he turns the water off, which I think is a great scene.
Yeah, no, it is.
Yeah.
Do you
But I
remember?
think you're right.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
Oh, that's all right. I think you're right about the shots, though, how they work to form that hierarchy and give
Yeah.
and characterize him as a strong dictator. I'm just looking at that scene, too, where the old guy looks through the binoculars.
Yeah. I mean, it's very much, and I know that he's built up, right? So obviously, in order to see both of them, they're that way. But you could have shot it very differently. But the way that John Seale chose to shoot that was looking over the shoulder and looking from Immortan Joe's perspective down, right? He's always looking down on them, and I'm sure it's something where if you live up there, you're always looking down on somebody. That's only going to feed that whole dictator. I'm their lord, their god almost, right? Over these people.
Right, yeah. And, it's only accessed, through this lift and the chains, and the workers are the ones, or the war boys are the ones who run everything. And, yeah, he's definitely the, iconic dictator who has his army and just lords over everyone. Yeah, I think he uses that as the cinematography, I think, enhances that division.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, from the original Mad Max, do you remember a character named Toe Cutter? Way back 1979, like the original one. No,
it's been a while.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I haven't seen him, so I don't know. I was curious. Toe Cutter apparently is the guy, the same actor who plays Immortan Joe, Hugh Keys.
Oh, right,
Byrne.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I
I didn't know
his
if he
name,
played
but
like a main character or.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had heard that, but I don't remember him specifically from earlier on, but I did hear that he was playing the same basic character.
Yeah. Oh, of course, by the time he's Immortan Joe, I guess,
Right.
you don't really see his face, right? Most of it.
No, which I think is great. There's so much hidden.
Yeah. That mask.
Yeah.
So the next sequence was about 12 minutes in, and this is where Furiosa takes off with the war rig, and then she goes off course. And something that I'm interested to get your perspective on here is the way it was shot. So you have the Citadel on one side. That's where Immortan Joe and everybody lives there, right? We just saw. And then you have Gastown, and that's where they're going to. And they say, signal Gastown, and you can see almost like a submarine. You see like Morse code, the lights going back and forth. And what's really interesting, just from a camera's perspective, shooting photography and video, I know it's really tough to get both sides in a single shot, right, or in a single sequence to tell like this is the start and this is the end. And it seems initially like it would be real easy because it's just one straight road from one to the other, right, across this vast desert. But when they go off course, and then you see Immortan Joe look through the telescope of some sort, and you see from his perspective that they're really not that far there, and it just really puts a sense of, again, the vastness of the desert, because they had been driving the war rig and it had been a while, and you see some perspective shots where they're driving. It looks like they're going really fast and they're making good time, and then all of a sudden they veer off course and they're like maybe like 1/16 of the way. I mean, they're like barely there, right? I mean, it's just one of those things where it's just again, the cinematography really helps pull back that desert as a character and just this whole vastness of this entire universe, this entire world that they've created. It's just, I don't know. Right. I was just really impressed with the way that they shot that.
Well, I think it's doing a similar thing to what you alluded to before, where you have a perspective of, in this case, Immortan Joe looking through, like the old man with the binoculars. He's looking through his telescope, which shows, that you can't really run. He's got these tools that he can use, and these people and these spies, and sort of everyone's sort of under his thumb, and he's an overlord, and he can see you wherever you are. You can't hide because there's no damn trees to hide from. So I think that choice to look through the lens again was a good one. Of course, that was probably just a an effect that they did post.
Yeah, it kind of makes me wonder, though, as you're saying that you can't run, it makes me wonder if he has that set up. One, it shows that he doesn't trust, right? So he's going to watch you all the way from the start to the end, which kind of leads you to assume that every single time they've made this trip that he's watching the entire time. But also it makes you wonder if that sort of thing has happened before, where that something caused him to lose that trust, or is he just, I mean, he certainly could be the type of guy who just doesn't trust, just because of the type of society that they've set up. It's not really one that's built on trust by any means.
Yeah, I think I remember it being said Toe Cutter wasn't a trusting individual.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, that name doesn't really seem like somebody you'd want to trust, but take your word for it.
Toe Cutter and Morton Joe. He's like Prince. He just switched his name.
So the next section I want to talk about, it's maybe about 17 minutes in, and it's not really cinematography, but I'm really curious because I can't pass this up. So the guitar guy on the huge truck, right? So throughout music, throughout history rather, music has been a huge part of war. You have flutes and bagpipes and drummers, and it all kind of helps with the morale of the troops. But just curious, what do you think about this whole take on this musician? You know, you got the drummers on the back of the truck, but you've got the guitarist and the flames. And did you like that take, or do you think it could have been done better in some other way? Maybe just kind of more traditional, just beating drums or something like that. Or I don't know. Just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Like as an introduction to that sort of war musician character?
Just the fact that there's a guy playing pretty much like metal guitar on the truck.
Character itself.
Do you think that kind of that fits, or do you think there could have been something more appropriate in that place? Because I'm assuming that's using electricity of some sort, which is using power, which is something that's important to them, as opposed to just maybe just the beating of the drums, right? Or does that extra little bit of using up power, does that seem to fit into that world?
I think that it fits kind of in the world of George Miller. You know, when I saw when that it.
So yes, I mean it's the same world, right?
That scene that you're describing when you're introduced to the guy who looks like he's in red pajamas or something. He's like this this Angus Young character, right? This Australian rocker guy.
Yes.
And it's also one of the most iconic images in the movie that you see over and over when that camera comes around and then stops, and he's sort of on the left-hand side, and you see the enormity of all of these vehicles stretching out to the left. I don't know. I was probably yelling at that point. I loved it so much. I mean, it's like it fit perfectly with the overtopness of what would a Morton Joe have? What kind of war would he have? Well, of course he would have that.
Yeah,
of course he would want somebody to play the guitar, as opposed, like Phantom of the Opera, somebody playing the organ or something, and to have him on, to have him on suspended on those bungees or whatever, just fits in with the whole sort of, I guess, the theme of the mob that they have, the war, right, with the polecats, and they're sort of these acrobats as well, and their whole over the top mentality of they're basically, they don't care if they die, right? The main character, what's his name, Vox or something, the one, what's his name plays?
Nux or
the one, Nux, Nux. He goes out thinking that he's going to die and be on the road to glory, to Valhalla. And when you're dealing with people who have that mentality, it makes it really hard for the average person, who does care.
Well,
if
he's built
die.
a religion, basically, right? I mean, and this, I guess, this guitar would be the music of the religion, right?
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, music, it sort of whips people up. That's the purpose of it. Whether it's the guy at the drum or the fife, or this dude. I think it's to keep the adrenaline going.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the shot of the camera coming up, and that kind of leads into the next section, which is about 20 minutes in. It's right after this scene where her war rig comes in, and then the war boys that are with her, they don't realize she's really revolting yet, but there's some, I think they call them buzzards, just like other rogue guys, basically just bad guys that we don't really know anything about. They come in and start fighting. It's kind of the first big driving fight sequence that we have, and the cinematography on this is just kind of a teaser of what's to come, but it's really amazing if you take a step back and think about it, because you've got the cars that are moving really fast, and then the camera has to move even faster to pan and sweep and just keep this really fluid motion. I mean, the logistics of that are just crazy, right? I mean, how many, this is kind of a rhetorical question, but how many takes do you have to do to get it just right? Because that's not something you can really fix in post. To some degree, maybe, right? But for the most part, that's going to be done in camera, especially if what you were saying before, where George Miller wants everything to be centered, it has to be done just right.
I know that they used extensively these crane arms. They're called edge armed or something. They had vehicles that had them, and it was I think it's an American company that produces these and ships them over there for about $1 million a piece, and I think they had 3 of them.
I got like 4 of them on driveway right now.
But they said that they were really just outstanding. We're talking about they can stretch out to like 25 feet or more. Those heads can go 270 degrees tilt, 350 degree pan, something like that. He says you could basically do anything. So they got these things running beside all of this stuff, and they said it was just so fluid and so smooth that I think that they actually had to end up putting in shake in it and post.
Wow.
I think it was just the planning, though. Overall, you just got a talented group of people who have planned and practiced for years to do this, and they just do it well.
And then they just show off.
Yeah.
Pretty much, yeah. Well, after this sequence, and then they go into basically this huge dust storm. It's about 27, almost 28 minutes in. What did you think of the shots in this sequence? Because again, it kind of going back to the desert as a character, and I know I've kind of harped on this, but this is kind of where that villain almost fights back for the first time, because you have these massive storms, and I loved that establishing shot of, you see this massive war rig, right, and it's just this teeny tiny little speck that's driving slowly into this huge, massive storm. I don't know. It just that shot just nails home that huge, just the vastness of the entire desert. And I know I've said that before, but again, it just hits you right there.
Right. I think that also, I mean, it's a beautiful shot. I'm looking at it right now. It's a gorgeous shot. Just both from how they framed, how they got way back there. Like, it's like they're probably at least 2 or 3 miles away from the action, shooting that plate, and then afterwards when the VFX put that in, just did a wonderful job. I think it definitely highlights that the vastness of this world, and how far or how long it takes to get from one place to the other right now, you can't hide. But it also, I think, shows the desperation, not only of Furiosa, but also the extent of the cruelty and the just insanity of the war boys, that they're just like, it shows, it's in the cab with Charlize, it's in the cab with Immortan Joe, it's showing the storm, and nobody's going, maybe we should stop. Maybe somebody should stop here before we all go in there. They're all like, yeah, we're going into the storm, I guess.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. It just adds to that whole cult religious type aspect of just, it is a cult following. I mean, they pretty much believe he's their god, right? I'll take you to Valhalla myself.
Right. And nobody's even batting it. Yeah, nobody's even batting an eye. You have that scene where Immortan Joe, he's from the side, and he's got his compass on his dash, and it starts going whirling around and around. Like, you're entering this especially horrible place within
Yeah.
this horrible place. So you're thinking, holy
Yeah.
shit, what is this? You know? Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned the VFX, and that's something that's interesting. I wanted to touch on as kind of a side note. Do you know how many VFX shots there were in this film? Because I know initially when this was released, everybody was touting all the practical effects and how they did everything practically, and there were no VFX and things like that. But there's actually a lot more VFX in this film than initially people thought.
Yeah.
Do you just take a ballpark guess? I don't know if you have the number in front of you, but I looked this up.
How many shots have some element?
Yeah, how many
I'll
shots?
Go by a
How
percentage.
many shots have VFX?
I would say percentage-wise, I don't know.
So there's
It's a lot.
2,700 total shots in the film. About 2,700 total shots.
Yeah, I'd say
So
about
out of that,
75%. Yeah.
Yeah, there's about 2,000 VFX shots out of 2,700 total shots.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which, so for some context, if you're not familiar with VFX, so Star Wars: A Force Awakens had about 2,100 VFX shots. So almost as many as Star Wars, which, granted, I mean, you've got Furiosa, who's missing an arm, right? And obviously, Charlize Theron is not missing an arm. So that's going to, anytime she's in a shot, you're going to have the VFX of taking her out. So it's not like these massive star scenes or like this massive, storm isn't through the whole thing. But there's still, I was really surprised with that when I first saw it, because I did think that they specifically tried to shy away from using VFX, and I think they did a really good job of using VFX to where it would help push the story forward, right? Where it's not just using it just to use it, but almost where you just don't think it's there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really doesn't surprise me that much. I think that they had a lot of practical effects in it. I think that's
for
true.
Sure.
But if you go by what constitutes a shot having a VFX element in it, that could be something as simple as there's an RF tower in the background of this shot, and we're gonna have to roto that out.
Right.
And that shot, so you're going to count that. The fact that they're out there in the open and that there were these things, like you can't hide, not even in the movie, but also the crew, right? It's hard to hide the vehicles with the cameras, other people standing by, focus pullers, that kind of thing. And so there's going to be a lot of rotoscoping and taking out of things. In addition to just, I know that a lot of the scenes were shot, and they had like a couple of mock-ups of the trucks, a couple of the war rigs, and they did what they call it. It's like a steady traveling shot where they have the truck that's just parked there, but they have it on sitting on these special apparatus with airbags, and they can make it
look
shake.
like it's moving.
Yeah. And they shot a lot of stuff in that cab with the truck just completely stationary, a green screen beside them, and then you have, like when Charlize is in there with the mothers, somebody has to put something going by on the opposite on the opposite window, right? And so you have to have that. Where something like Star Wars, right? You could do a complete interior, and then just build a set around it and not even need VFX. But in this, there's nowhere for the environment to hide, right? Because there's a window somewhere, there's a rear view mirror, it's just all shot on the move and out in the open.
Right. Well, not only that, you mentioned the practical. There were a lot of practical effects for sure. A lot, maybe arguably, more than a typical movie these days, it seems. But the more practical effects you have, especially in a movie like this that requires so many stunt shots, I think that also is going to push up the VFX, because I know, looking at a lot of the behind the scenes for this, a lot of the VFX was for safety purposes, right? Where you have this huge explosion that you've done practically, but you can't have your actors as close to it as you want to make it seem. So you're going to have things that you're going to comp together, and you're going to, I think one of the explosions, we haven't quite gotten to it yet, but it was an explosion later on where, like, huge, massive, I think it was like when the gas goes off and it explodes, right? They actually exploded something further away, shot that, basically the ball of flame, and then moved that or comped that in later on, and then comped a bunch of trucks and things like that around it to make it look like these actors and these characters are much closer than they could be without burning up, right? So for safety purposes, you're going to have a lot of that as well. And that's something I think a lot of people don't think about it until you take a step in and be like, oh yeah, well that makes sense. I mean, you want to make it portray like you're having this massive action sequence, and yeah, you can do a ton of that with stunts, but it doesn't make sense to risk somebody's life any more than you already do when you're doing stunts if you don't have to, especially when you have as many explosions as they have.
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious if you just kind of watch the movie kind of slowly in reverse. Some of those action scenes back where there are lots of people falling off of vehicles, getting shot, or it's pretty clear when you've got a digital character falling to the ground and when you've got a real person swinging on a pole in front of a green screen. But at the end of the day, you've got these people going 50 miles an hour through the desert on these things, harnessed in, doing this crazy stuff so that they can put a CGI character in the fall. And so I think it's probably a really good marriage between the two, where you take it right up to the point where, safety's a concern now. And let's put in a CG character. But he was talking about they had people strapped underneath vehicles with cameras. They had, and going down the road or going down the desert underneath these things at 50 miles an hour. That's if something had broken, a harness had broken, it was just the end. You're not going to stop this entire train of vehicles.
Yeah, no kidding. All right, so we're kind of in the big tornado, right? Or storm of some sort. There's multiple tornadoes, it almost looks like. And you've got Nux, the main war boy. There's about 28 minutes or so in. And he has that now famous line that's in, I think it's in pretty much all the trailers. He's like, oh, what a day. Oh, what a lovely day. What the camera cuts to a bobblehead. It almost looks like a little crow thing. It's all mechanical, kind of made. It's kind of bouncing up and down, nodding in approval to what he just said. And I want to take that opportunity to kind of talk about, I know the camera cuts a lot throughout this entire movie. It cuts around to the various pieces of the different cars and just showing a lot of the detail. Did you like that aspect of cutting away to not necessarily the characters or where the actions are, but almost bringing in the vehicles to be another character, where, like in that instance where you have, the little bobblehead, almost replying to an actual character, almost turning that vehicle into a character in and of itself. Did you like that, or did that take you out of the story, or what were your overall thoughts of all of those different types of cuts?
Well, with respect to the bobblehead, I guess I think that it didn't take me out of the story because it wasn't that long. And you see it in a couple of other shots, too, that are sort of wider. I'm looking at it right now. For me, it just was, I don't know if it has something to do, it's like maybe could be an homage to some of the earlier movies. I don't know. Some of the nerds out there might know this. But to me, it just sort of said, it sort of was an indicator of the insanity of this whole thing, right? Of Nux, and how he was completely just eat up with the idea of dying and being martyred and having a Morton Joe sort of be in his good graces and be a warrior, a war boy. And I think that you see that as sort of like a physical reminder of the insanity. And all the while, he is unhooking the hoses and letting all the fuel into the cab, getting ready to make himself, just explode himself in front of the truck and kill her and get the girls back, or just stop it. That's sort of what I think that the interior cuts and everything worked very well. I don't think they were too quick. I think that they were sort of needed to get that sense of how short a time Mad Max had to get into that cab and grab that flare from him. Yeah. So I thought that the quickness of the cuts was motivated by that heavily.
Makes sense. Yeah. So then of course, moving right along.
I was going to say, all of that, of course, is followed up by an incredible, just stationary static shot after the flare goes away and they fade out and you come back.
Oh,
up
that was great. Again, center action, right? The flare right there
Yeah.
in the middle, and just that was
go from this.
that. I mean, that was almost
Yeah.
expect an intermission, right? I mean, it was just like, oh, okay, we just end this part right here.
Right. Well, that's one of the hallmarks, I think, of this movie that makes it, as I was referring to earlier, compromise. It's action that's done well, that's done where with the audience in mind. For me, something that's just constantly, it's hard to follow, that's constantly cutting, that's sort of chaos cinema. The downfall is that you don't know what's going on. You get disoriented, you get pulled out of the story, and honestly, it just becomes boring to me. Like when I do watch Transformer movies, there comes a point where it's just boring. Like I've got this sensory overload. It's not affecting me the way that they want it to because there's just so much of it. And this scene where they stop the insanity and the camera just sits there. What I think is beautiful about this is every time I see it, it looks like you're looking at something far away, a giant mountain, right? You've got the smoke in the background, and slowly Mad Max raises his head up and you realize, oh shit, that's not a mountain, that's the main character, right? You're completely disoriented in the fact that your perspective is off. This is actually, you're really close to someone, not far away. But it's so serene and quiet, and you're given the chance to sort of relax and go, wow, that was fucking intense. Let's have what you said, like an intermission from that, so that we don't overwhelm the audience. And to me, that's keeping the audience in mind and not being gratuitous and just doing it for doing its sake.
That's a really good point. I didn't think about that, but that does actually lead right into the next sequence, because I think they flip right back real quickly. It's about 33, almost 34 minutes in, and it's when, after Max kind of wakes up from that, and he goes off and he fights Furiosa. He comes across Furiosa after the car wrecks, and it's one of the first, other than the very beginning where Max is trying to run away, it's like the first hand-to-hand fight. And this was interesting to me because I got this very handheld effect. And it's again interesting. You mentioned Paul Greengrass. Like, the very first thing that came to mind when I saw this handheld fight between Max and Furiosa is basically a Jason Bourne movie where you've got this handheld fight effect of the jerky, and it's very much contrasting the vehicles and the smooth movements and all of that. And I'm sure, obviously it was done on purpose, but I wonder if a lot of that was to contrast, again, the handheld versus in a vehicle.
Yeah, I definitely think that the purpose of this, when we cut from that moment where we saw it fades out from the flare, I think that the purpose of that up to when Mad Max finds the war rig is to sort of give the audience a time to sort of rest, I think. Plus, there's some really, really great plot points in there. You see that Max is chained to this guy, chained to Nux, right? He tries everything he can to get loose from him. He doesn't have the tool. The gun won't work. He ends up having to carry him across the desert, and he's got the door with him, right? And it's really funny.
That was
for
great.
one thing. But that's sort of his charm. I think the character is that he has to do these incredibly difficult things out of desperation, and he's always
just
sort of
nothing
the
goes
shit
right.
end of the
Nothing
stick.
goes right.
Right, except for when he arrives, right, out of the worst situation into what could be the best situation of his life, as the camera shows these 6 women who are bathing themselves, right, in water. It looks like a 1980s hairband video, like they're having some kind of car wash out here. And so the contrast of that is really, really effective. I love it.
Yeah, that was great.
and of course it's at the exact time that one of the girls cuts off her chastity belt and it falls to the ground, right? And you get this great cut back to Max, who's like, what the hell is going on here, man?
Yeah, you could kind of see the gears turning in his head where
Yeah.
he's like, I don't know what's going on.
But
All
this
right,
is
the
one of my
next
favorite scenes. I think this is one of the greatest fight scenes ever filmed. It's certainly my favorite scene of the movie, because it is in contrast to the fighting in the vehicles, right? We have the first
Yeah.
hand, well, not necessarily first hand to hand, I guess the intro part when they're pulling him back into but the first sort of major one.
Yeah.
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 But you have these, at this point, you're introduced to the three main characters, Nux, Furiosa, and Max, right? And so the fight between them is intimate, and the stakes are higher emotionally for us because we know who they are now. We know that what he's gone through. We know what she's gone through to do this. We know that they don't know one another, and they really don't have anything in common other than they're in this shitty situation. And the fact that they're chained together, I just think it's genius. The way that they're forced to fight one another, but also defend someone else who is their enemy. Like he and Nux sort of team up against her, but he keeps getting undermined by the girls who yank his chain, right?
Literally, yeah.
Yeah, it's great. And John Seal was talking about this scene, and one of the things that they had done was the gaffers had rigged up. They brought over like one of those fork cranes, and they hung up a rig from it where they had bungee cords on it, and they strapped all the cameras onto it. So they didn't. It was a steady cam of sorts, but it wasn't like a steady cam rig where you would think of. They just had them on bungee cords, and they were able to move left and right and forward and backwards, and give it the amount of angle. You see a lot of high angles, a lot of low angles in this sequence. And I think that it was that rigged system that gave them the freedom to move around like that and really get in there in the fight, and keep everything really fluid. And keep that, and most importantly, keep the centering aspect, the centering aesthetic.
Keeping it consistent.
Keeping it consistent. I think this is the best example of that, that centering aesthetic.
And so that was your favorite sequence.
Oh, I love
film,
it.
Huh? As far as cinematography,
because, I mean, you contrast this fight scene with something in The Bourne Identity or any of those movies, right? I don't think that they read this well at all. For one thing, there's the vacuousness of everything in the background. There's really nothing in the background, so all you have are these figures. So you're on an anamorphic frame, right? You have this wide frame. It's 135 by 1, and your eyes can tend to roam off to the side, depending upon what's going on. But there's nothing to look at other than these characters.
So you're just going to bounce right back. Yeah.
Right.
But do you think a lot of that it has to do with what you were saying before, where this film lends itself to giving you those breaks, right? Where, like we just came off of a break, and then we have this intense action. Do you think that lends to to being able to read it better, not necessarily because of the cinematography in the actual sequence itself, but because of the way that it's sandwiched between scenes that give you a break essentially from that action, whereas one of the Bourne movies is just action after action, scene after scene after scene. It's just pounding, all of that movement where it can break you down and you start to get tired. Do you think that's the case, or just the actual cinematography itself in this particular scene? Do you see that as being different enough from one of the Bourne movies?
I think it works on me differently. I think both of my answer to both those questions is yes. I think that this works because it serves as a kind of intermission. It is a much more intimate scene. You have you go from fighting from vehicles in literally miles and miles of of car chase to a fight scene that takes place within 30 square yards, something like that. There's nothing. Right. So he's able to cut. This is probably one of the fastest cutting sequences too. I don't know that for a fact, but it sure seems like it. It is really fast, but you don't notice it because of the center framing, and because you've already been established everything in the scene that exists: the truck, the people, and the sky behind them.
Yeah.
other than the desert floor itself. And that's pretty much all you have to remember. And because there's so few elements, and because he constantly keeps the action and the faces in the center of the frame, he can cut crazy fast, and it just has a much different effect to me. I can read it, I can understand it. He's mixing the emotions of who these characters are within it, and it's not just a gratuitous violence. It's also setting up. It's also the beginning of Max and Furios's relationship, right?
Yeah.
This is how every date I ever had went. That's how it started.
Mad Brian, Fury Road. No, it's interesting you talk about that kind of as compared to the vehicles, right? I know I mentioned it earlier too, but the next sequence is about 53 minutes in, and it's also something that I saw a lot of contrast in as far as the way it's shot, where after you have this handheld fight, then you go to this. You're not back where you don't go back into the next fight being another way out in the open desert, right? Instead, you're in this rocky corridor. That's where Furiosa takes the war rig, and again, the buzzards kind of come and they attack. They're not very happy that she has war parties after her, I guess. So, but the way that this is shot, I saw it being different than the shots of the fights out in the desert, right? Where you've got more shots. At least I noticed more shots, and maybe this was just kind of a thing that I just happened to notice, and it's not necessarily true technically, but it seemed like there were more shots from underneath the vehicles or in confined spaces, almost similar to almost giving you the feeling of you are restricted by this corridor of rocks and things, as opposed to a lot of the fights earlier. There's much more space around, right? Mm-hmm. Because you're in this open desert, and now you've got the cinematography helping to almost make you feel almost claustrophobic to an effect, right? I mean, you're still in this massive vehicle, so realistically, it's not that claustrophobic. But just the way that the cinematography puts you, underneath the war rig or underneath one of the vehicles. I can't remember the guy. The first vehicle that goes up the little ramp of rocks that the buzzards they blow up, and there's all these rocks that fall down. The first vehicle that goes under, you see some shots from like underneath the car, and just I liked the way that it helped to give you that closed, confined feeling, and again make it not jumping right back into, oh, okay, we're back in the desert and there's this huge fight again that, I mean, we've seen before, but I don't know, it just adds to that, the contrast again, which is just kind of a base level, getting back to the basics of great design is contrast, right? And so when you're designing how movies should be laid out, you're going to think about the contrast. And I don't know, what did you think about that scene where they're fighting in the corridor? Did you see any of that contrast, or is that just something that I'm making up in my head?
The corridor being where wherever they come in and it narrows down, the road does, and then
it narrows down the road. They're kind of forced to go into almost like a one-lane type area. Yeah, about 53 minutes into the movie.
I think that there's a lot to be said about in the entire movie about relativity, the relationship between these contrasts that you're talking about, which I think are there. The contrast between the vastness of this world and the confined space of the cab, which an enormous amount of the story takes place in, right? This claustrophobic part. The enormity of the space with these really close-up shots of faces and characters fighting. The wide open expanse of the road when they go into the storm versus this really one path, narrowed path that they have to go through. It's sort of part of, I think it works to sort of like the intermission works for the violence and the action. It is something to play off and to enhance the other thing. So the action becomes intense because of the lull, and the expansiveness of the environment becomes even wider by the narrowing of the road. Or I should say maybe the narrowing of the road becomes more claustrophobic because of the expansiveness of what you just got through experiencing for the first 40 minutes. Right. I think that those things are playing off one another, enhancing it.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And that's kind of what I was feeling too, is it's not only kind of a different environment, but I don't know, to me it did seem like there were more shots of close-ups places. And I like that you mentioned being inside the cab of the truck. There is a lot of the movie that's shot inside that cab.
Right.
Which
it's a road movie, right?
can be very... Yeah, no kidding. But I mean, that can be very claustrophobic, but you don't really... At least I never got that feeling from it. It felt like it was... There's the Max and Furiosa, and then there were 3 other women in there. Is that right? Or was there 4 at that point?
I think there are 4 mothers and going there. When they come back, they pick up more, obviously. But I think originally...
Right, but there's 6 people essentially in the cab, which if you have 6 people piled into... I mean, granted, it's basically a semi-truck, but still 6 people, it could seem very claustrophobic, but I never really got the sense of it being claustrophobic. Right. If that makes sense. Like the way it was shot, it was it still felt very open, as opposed to in this particular scene. I think it kind of did help to start that feeling of feeling claustrophobic and feeling like this isn't the way it should be. There is something wrong here. Almost puts you on edge.
Well, I think they chose the right cameras. From what I understand, they found some cameras that were small enough that they could put in there, and they put like 3 or 4, I believe, tucked away. I think they used like 15 millimeter lenses on a lot of these shots, so they're working, really tight, but with wide lenses, so they're able to. But at the end of the day, Seal was saying, it didn't really matter if we got a really wide lens so that you could see, for example, the girls behind Furiosa's head or behind Max's head, so that we could compose them in the shot on the left side or something like that. Because he would still say, put the crosshairs on his nose, put the crosshairs on his nose. So it wouldn't really matter as long as you could fit the action, the object, or the person of interest within the frame, even inside the truck. But I think that they made a good choice on lenses for those scenes. I think it took some doing, but I think they made it work.
Yeah, no, I agree. So the next sequence is about a few minutes later. It's maybe 56 minutes in. And you mentioned before that the handheld fight was your favorite sequence, but I think this one is my favorite sequence. And I'll explain why. So basically this sequence is where Furiosa is driving, and Immortan Joe is driving his car up next to Furiosa, and he pulls out the gun, and he's going to shoot Furiosa, right? And then Splendid comes, opens up the back door, and basically stands between them. And then you have this little discussion between Joe and Nux, and he's going to go off and get Furiosa for Joe and that kind of thing. But the reason why this was my favorite is because in this sequence, I can see pretty much everything about the movie that I like. And it goes from this big, massive fight on the road to all of a sudden that drowns out. You don't even notice it drowning out, but it drowns out, and now it's almost a conversation between. It's almost like there's just 2 people in a room, Furiosa and Immortan Joe, and you see him pointing the gun, and then all of a sudden a third person steps into the room, and that's Splendid. And just the way that it was shot, it was, I don't know, it's amazing to me how quickly everything. There's all this action going on, and then all of a sudden there's no action going on, and all you care about are the characters and the story, and it's just right there. And I'm sure a lot of it has to do with that, centering the frame, right, to where it's very much showing you what to focus on, so you're going to drown the edges out. But I don't know, this particular sequence, and for that reason, it was just my favorite one. It wasn't like there was this big, huge thing that made it my favorite, but just it has all of the little tiny elements that just work together really well.
Yeah. It might be part of it because of the. I think that this is a major point in the movie, right, where Immortan Joe sort of realizes that the girls haven't necessarily been kidnapped as much as escaped, right?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
And
that's
so
true.
you have Splendid, who swings the door open, and she's pregnant, and she puts herself in between her and Max and Furiosa and says, "Don't shoot." Like, she's looking at Morton Joe, staring him down, and of course he can't because he doesn't want to damage his property. But there is a very intimate moment, I think, which is what you're responding to here, where you can see these characters within their vehicles, but it's very intimate. Like, there's not a bunch of stuff. There's not a bunch of other people, especially in Immortan Joe's vehicle. It's just him, and he's just responding to Splendid opening the door, and the stakes are just raised, and everybody's it's sort of like a Mexican standoff, right? Nobody wants to shoot. Everybody's got a gun pointed at one another.
Yeah.
And it's a scene that's very, very charged with emotion.
Yeah.
And kinetic energy, because as they're doing this, they're going down the desert at like 50 or 60 miles an hour in these trucks. But there's a moment where everything's sort of like just like still, and their decisions have to be made. And again, I think that works from the contrast of, you see crap whipping by them in the background, but everybody's stationary having these intimate conversations with one another. And now you have Nux being sprayed with that silver crap in the mouth by Morton Joe, and you know, and So I think there's that sense of, it sort of represents us. I think humanity, at a certain extent, not to get too deep or anything, but
Getting
we're on
deep there,
this
Brian,
ball. We're hurtling through the universe at hundreds of thousands of miles an hour, but everything seems still and quiet for the most part.
I think that the big question there is, who are you in that sequence? If that's Earth, right? If that's kind of the metaphor, are you Immortan Joe? Are you Nux? Are you Splendid? What? Are you Furiosa? Who are you? Okay, that might be a little too deep.
I'm pretty sure you're Morton Joe. No, I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting question, I think, about who the audience identifies with most.
Yeah.
For me, it was Furiosa. I think, Charlene's character, I think, carried the movie intentionally.
Oh yeah, she's the
she's sort
hero
of the every person. Yeah, she's sort of the hero, and Max is sort of helping her. Big dumb lummox who's kind of the anti-hero, who helps because he's been put in a situation.
Yeah. Was that the case in the previous movies where Max was almost the side character?
No, I never felt that way. No, I identified with Max as the hero of the rest of them. Now, he had helpers and stuff, seems like, but no, he was the dude. Yeah, this was different. Okay. And intentionally so, I think, on Miller's part. And I think a better movie overall. Or it certainly went with the whole theme of, strong females and, feminism and all this other stuff.
All right, well, next sequence would be about an hour and 4 minutes into the movie, so we're moving along. And this is the first night shot in the film, right? So what really struck with me was not necessarily the framing aspect of it, but the way that they used the colors, just extreme blues, and then the only other color other than just extreme blues is that little orange lamp that the girls are holding in the back seat. And this is something that when I looked up how they actually shot this, it was really interesting because they actually shot that during the day, and it was bright out. And if you look closely, it's some of the guys. Yeah, it was a day shot, and the guy Rictus, he's standing next to Immortan Joe. I don't remember the actor's name, but Rictus was the character name, and to me, it almost looked like he was squinting. And I saw an interview with one of the VFX supervisors, and or it was the editor actually, and they're handed the shot, and they were like, what are we supposed to do with this? Like, you have the actors actually squinting in the light. It's so bright outside. How are we supposed to make this look like it's nighttime? But they did, and they made it look almost too realistic. With the compositors and the color correctors, and then they ended up having to dial it back into this very stylized look that you have in order to get something that would match the world that they're going for, instead of just a regular night, right? Obviously, this is not just a regular world. We saw the massive storm and things like that. So, what did you think about this? Just shooting it during the day and then turning it into a night shot. Do you think it could have been better if they had just shot it at night instead of shooting it during the day?
Yeah, I'm not that up to the technical side of that as far as VFX goes. It seems like to me it would be better on post-production side, because you're going to be able to capture more of the action without going up more stops to try and gather more light, and possibly running or lowering getting your ISO more sensitive film, or on your sensor, and then maybe getting some noise in the shot. I know that
it's interesting.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, interesting you mentioned that, because they actually, when they shot it during the day, they ran some tests. I was looking this up, and they ran some tests, and they actually intentionally overexposed that. So they shot it 2 full stops overexposed during the day, and that was the shot that they ended up going with, because they liked the way that it looked once they converted that to the night style look. But it was really interesting that not only did they shoot it during the day, but like you're saying, that you can capture more information, but then they almost just threw that out and overexposed in order to get this really stylized look.
Yeah, I remember hearing that story too, and I know that CEO, I didn't really understand it 100%, but it had something to do with he was really worried about doing that. He did not want to do that at all, and the DIT guy, he said, the digital intermediary technician, was telling them, no, this is what we want to do, so it's going to work, and he was like really skeptical about it. But he said in the end, because he didn't understand what they would be doing with the footage on the other end, it had to do with they would be able to pull up what was in the shadows without introducing noise into the shot.
Right. Right.
There's something that had to do with that, which was their justification for shooting it over. Yeah, it's like you're saying. I guess at the end of the day, what you want is you want all of the information you can get without peeking out. Because you can move that stuff around so much in post now. So I don't know, but yeah, it was interesting. I hadn't heard about the squinting, the actor's performance or anything. But as far as the stylization of the night, I think that Miller's idea is that it really doesn't look like night. It just gives the sense of night. It's gorgeous in that everything sort of is the same tone, right? You have this beautifully graded blue effect over the top of it, and that as long as you give the sense that this is night, that nobody's really ever going to question this. And especially they're not going to question it in this world, because nobody knows what the hell night looks like on the Mad Max world. Maybe this is it,
we've seen
right?
day this entire time, yeah.
Yeah. This could be something. Could be just how it looks, and I think that it works for a world like this.
Yeah, it definitely does. I love the stylization of it. I just thought it was really interesting that the way that they went about that. And I wonder if there were more shots at night throughout the film, if they would have still gone about it that way, or if they would have changed how they shot that. Because even though it was shot during the day, overexposing the way they did, they shot it differently than they did for the regular shots during the day. So it was something that they knew that they were going to be shooting it differently. It was not something like, oh hey, let's make this at night afterwards. So they knew about it going into it for sure.
Yeah, there were probably lots of considerations too. The safety is a factor at night. As far as the actors go and the stunt people go, you got to take that in consideration. You got to take in consideration lighting.
Yeah.
And I think that George is pretty adamant about, we don't need lights. We don't need lights in these scenes. At least according to Seal, he said he would sneak on some lights occasionally, and Miller would tell him, "Get those out of there. We don't need them."
When he doesn't, quick, his back is turned to get it.
Right, right. Or he'd just say, "Well, we're going to fix it in post. Don't worry about it. We'll fix it in post."
And it's what every visual effects artist loves to hear, right? Fix it in post. Fix it in post. That's
right.
said sarcastically, but. All right, the next scene is about an hour and 35 minutes in, and we're kind of near the end of the film, but got a couple more left. This is when Furiosa finds out that they kind of reached their destination, and they find out their destination is not what they thought it was. It's not there anymore. The green place they're going to is no more. The many mothers that they're going to, kind of their sanctuary, and the people where Furiosa was born, we find out. They're not there. I mean, there's a couple of them, but not nearly as many as there used to be, apparently. We don't really find out how many there were, but the implication is that there's not as many. Mm-hmm. So what did you think about this last part? Because after this happens, when they head back, we have this really what essentially is the final big chase sequence towards the end of the film. And you've got... I didn't really see anything that's necessarily new as far as cinematography is concerned. It seems like everything has kind of been introduced so far, because we've seen some fights, we've seen some of the the character interactions and things like that. Mm-hmm. I didn't really see anything new. It just seemed like when you go to a fireworks show, it's like, okay, I've seen all of these before, but now you're just going to throw a billion of them at me all at once, and that's like the grand finale, right? I mean, it's just like... Mm-hmm. You've got the acrobatics and the polecats and the people jumping between vehicles and just everything. Just, it's like, yeah, we can do this, so let's just do a ton of it, right?
Right. Yeah, I think I'm watching some of this while you're talking. I just noticed something different is once one of the mothers, the ones who has the seed bearer, I don't know her technical name, but the old lady that has the bag of seeds. When she gets
I know who you're talking about.
Cut by one of the war boys. They introduce a lot of a very, very different style as she's sort of sitting there realizing that she's mortally wounded. They've got a really, really shallow depth of field. You can't really see the girls in the back anymore, although you can see them cringing. They've introduced this, they probably did this in post, I'm sure, but they introduced this, a lot of chromatic aberration around her. There's a lot out of focus as she reaches around to find her bag, so she's going to save it. That's one thing I'm seeing that's a little different from what you're talking about previously, but I think it's just stylistically and cinema in the cinematography, I think is basically the same.
Yeah, that's I just looked that up. The character is Keeper of the Seeds, so there you go.
Keeper of the Seeds,
played by Melissa Jaffer. So yeah, no, that's a good point. I didn't remember that particular scene, but yeah, I don't know. It was one of those things where even though there was nothing really new that stood out to me other than that sequence you just mentioned, but it didn't really matter. It seemed like it was I don't know, I just loved this last scene. It wasn't my favorite because I already mentioned my favorite, but if I had a second favorite, this would probably be it, because it was just everything technically, just being able to pull all of this off with all of the different people, the actors, the stuntmen, the stuntwomen, like the ability to be able to pull all of that off, just logistically, is something that it just blows my mind. I don't know. I wouldn't know where to start with that kind of stuff. It's just amazing.
Yeah. Well, before I forget, there was another pretty important thing that had to do more with editing, but it's connected with this idea of how I think Miller is able to create a really, really strong scene full of energy and action, but have it very understandable. And that has to do with frame rates. I learned this and didn't know it, and if you go back, you'll probably notice a lot of these scenes. He would shoot sometimes 10 frames a second, sometimes 8. I mean, he would push it to where you can tell, especially on a lot of shots where you're zooming in on somebody's face. Like I'm just watching that part where Nux's driver dude, his friend, he's pointing out the window, and the camera's moving towards him. Or there's a lot of fight scenes where it's sped up, what they call over cranking, one of those things held off from the old days when you actually had to crank the camera, or under cranking it or something like that. So you're speeding up the frame so that it looks a little bit more stop motion like. And you see this throughout the movie all the time. And he does this a lot in some of the fight scenes. And I think what it does is it, in addition to speeding up the action, literally, it does it without confusion. So there may be it does it just enough too, to where it's like you can kind of notice it, but it's not pulling you out. Like you subconsciously recognize that the movement isn't as, it's not 30 or 60 frames a second. It's not like, when they did The Hobbit, that it's 60 frames a second or whatever it was.
Yeah.
That was kind of noticeable. But it speeds up the action. Yeah, it speeds up. It's a way of not considering editing necessarily the cuts, but a way of speeding up the action just through frame rate itself that I think was very effective in building energy as opposed to cuts. And it's just another way you can do that without introducing more editing to confuse the audience.
Now, did you say they did that in camera, or did they drop frames afterwards?
It sounded like to me that they dropped frames afterwards, but I don't know if his workflow is to shoot it in a certain frame rate and then go in and do that. I tried to figure out how to do that last night in Final Cut, and I couldn't alter it.
Well, it would make more sense to drop frames because then you can, if you need to go back, you can. Whereas if you shoot it at a certain frame rate, you can't create more frames.
You can't.
There's software that can pretend to do that, but it's not the same, right?
Right.
Whereas you drop frames, you take those out, and it's a lot easier to do. Not saying it's easy, because you still have to, especially if you have a sequence where you're doing it for a specific purpose, then you're trying to make sure that the motion and such gets across the right way, right? So it's not like you're just dropping them willy-nilly. You're just, you want to make sure that it all works. That's interesting. I'll have to go back and watch it again now and keep that in mind. To look for that, because I didn't
again
know
that. another scene that I think it works extremely well was the one where they're fighting near the truck. If you go back to that scene, you look at the part where the girls are first pulling on Max's chain. He's fighting with Furiosa, but they pull him by the head, right? That whole next 2 or 3 shots, I think you can see everything's sped up just a little bit more to make it. People are moving quicker than they normally would. When Furiosa is got the bolt cutters and she's trying to hit him, and he grabs the car door and holds it up, that whole shot right there is sped up and you can see it. And he's
is that what I was kind of referring
around.
To, where it gave me that sense of almost being like a Jason Bourne movie? Do you think that's why I kind of equated it with that? I don't know anything about if they do that in the Jason Bourne movies, but if that's kind of one of those sequences where it's sped up that way, because I see that in I say the Jason Bourne movies because that's kind of where I first saw it, and that's that handheld, real shaky, real fast-paced action where you can't really tell what's going on. Even though I think you can read it a lot better in Mad Max, like you're saying, I still kind of got that vibe of this is different than a lot of the other action that we've seen, and so maybe that's what it was, and I didn't just connect it. Technically, how it was done, but just subconsciously, I knew that there was something different with that handheld scene as opposed to the other fights that we've seen. Yeah,
it could be, because I think he really does a great job of dialing it in just right, because you could overdo that real easy.
Oh, for sure.
Because it goes from, there's another, I'm watching it again, when Nux jumps out to grab her, right? She's going for the gun. She busts the skull open, grabs the gun, and he jumps on her.
Yeah.
And everybody's sort of moving at, 1.5 times speed. But but it doesn't feel out of place. It just feels like it's been kicked up just a bit, right? Given a bam, right? Just enough to create the effect, but not draw you out of the story. And I think that, coupled with the centering aesthetic, really makes this a movie that knows how to do action. Better. To me, it's a better way of achieving what you want than just straight cutting. And handheld camera that is so shaky that you can't understand where the hell you're at and you're disoriented. It's a masterful.
No, I agree. I mean, they definitely know how to do the action.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, the last sequence that we have is about an hour and 50 minutes in, and it's a 2-hour movie, so it's pretty much the end. It's where Max returns to the Citadel. And this, to me, was the cinematography was a perfect wrap, right? So almost like the hero's journey, right? Where the traditional storytelling, where the hero goes off, learns something, and comes back, right? And it was almost the same sort of thing, but for cinematography purposes, where we go off and we've done a bunch of different things, but then we come back and there's a little bit different, but it's almost the same as the very beginning, where you've got the massive sweeping sequences when you see Max returning, and you can see the huge the big rock fortresses or rock formations that they have out there. That's kind of the Citadel area. And then you've got the scene where, like almost when we saw Immortan Joe, where he's from his perspective looking down, and then from the people's perspective looking up. You've got the same sort of thing, but this time it's Furiosa as she's going up on the lift. She's looking down, and you've got Max who's in the crowd and he's looking up. I don't know, it just seemed like a great way of wrapping everything up, as far as not only as far as the story and that aspect of is concerned, but even just the way the cinematography was done. I saw a lot of parallels to the way the movie began, and it just seemed like just a perfect way to wrap it up. I mean, just a perfect ending sequence. What did you think of that last sequence in the film?
Well, I think you're right that there's a lot of continuity between the beginning, when we see, for example, the lowering of the truck down. There's the same exact shot. There's the same exact shot of when they first show all of those people on that wheel who climb up it to lower and raise the platform,
and they're pushing people off of it in the beginning. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. And they have the exact same shot. If you went back and probably did a screen cap of that and compared them, they're probably exactly the same shot. They just shot them at the same time. So I think that they intentionally kept a lot of consistency in that to you sort of bringing them home. But I think you bring up an interesting point about the camera placement as well, from a perspective of a high angle shot, looking down from the elite, right, who Immortan Joe's absence only leaves, and his son's the big lummox, what's his name? He died, right? But all that's left is that little guy that sits there and looks into the telescope, right? He's the only one sort of left. Yeah, I don't know his character's name, but he's sort of the only one left, and now you've got Max and Furiosa who are looking up at them as sort of champions of the downtrodden. They're among the people, right? And Max, probably my second favorite, is that look that he gives her right at the end. He sort of disappears into the mass of these people, and they're looking at one another. He's down there and she's looking down at him, and he's looking back up at her, and he just sort of nods his head, and then she nods as if that's all they had to say. They just went through this enormous experience together. And it was kind of like, well, thanks. You're welcome. And so, I think that, and then she ascends to be the benevolent leader, you think, of the people, and she releases all the water. But I think you're right in pointing out that those perspectives and the consistency of it sort of drives home Morton Joe's, being sort of ousted, and
Yeah.
the restoration of normal, quote unquote, normalcy for these people.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, we've that pretty much is an end of Fury Road. I know we've already talked about kind of our favorite sequences, but before we move on to announcing what our next movie will be, do you have any closing thoughts or anything that you want to chat about for Fury Road? Maybe not necessarily cinematography related, or just kind of closing thoughts on this movie.
I looked forward to it when it came out, and like you said, I watched it a couple times in theater. I was just blown away with it. It was better than I thought it would be, and I think it's due in large part to a lot of the things that we discussed today, that we're working on a very subtle but subconscious but effective level to create something that to me looked beautiful, felt just like a great action film, but was so different from some of the other action movies that we see a lot of today. It was just so different, not just because of the the world was different in there, but I think it was due to this aesthetic that he was going for, where he could give you the action that you wanted, he could give it to you in the proportion that you needed, and still let you understand the story, not take away from it, but just enhance it. It's not porn violence of Transformers, where it just becomes gratuitous. It's there to serve the movie, but it's so entertaining because it does serve the story, not the other way around. And that's what I respect about it. And I just wish we had more of them like that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it is definitely, like you said, it is different. I mean, it is certainly an action movie. And typically in a lot of action movies, you mentioned Transformers, great example. Story is not necessarily very strong in action movies like that. But you don't really go into it expecting a story, right? And so you expect that gratuitous action, like you mentioned, where it's just, that's what you go to see. I mean, you go to see Transformers because you want to see the Transformers. You don't go to see Shia LaBeouf or I'm blanking on the new guy, Mark Wahlberg. You don't really go to see them, right? You go to see the Transformers. You can go to see them transform and blow up and massive action sequences, that kind of stuff. And so when I saw Fury Road for the first time, I guess kind of to close out my thoughts on it, it really surprised me how much of the story I really enjoyed, and how much of it I really followed, because I went into it expecting that it was going to be, I knew the basic premise. It was, you're driving and fighting, and I expected it to be, a bunch of driving and fighting, and pretty much kind of like a Transformers, where there's really nothing much of a story, right? And I was pleasantly surprised that there was a story there. I mean, it wasn't like it was, this, I don't think it was an Oscar-worthy story, right? I mean, it wasn't, there's definitely movies out there with better stories, for sure. But as far as an action movie is concerned, where you've got this blend of straight-up action and story, I think it did a really good job of blending those elements together just right to pull off both of them really, really well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that's a discussion for a different day, the story. I mean, I personally liked it. There's a lot of commentary, political commentary, environmental, commentary in it that we could talk about all day long. But I agree. I think it's special in that way visually. As far as action movies goes, I think it's one of the best. Certainly the best execution. But yeah, I loved it.
Nice.
I'll watch it over and over again.
Nice. Well, you ready to announce our next movie? You're picking the next one. Are you going to pick Mad Max Fury Road again?
Yeah, we're just going to talk about
over.
a different aspect of it. This is just a Mad Max Fury Road podcast. Now,
Nice.
Our next movie is just came out. It is a
Okay.
Netflix original.
Oh, okay.
And it is one of the latest movies from an Asian director, Joon-ho Bong, also known as Bong Joon-ho. You might know him from a movie that he did a couple of years ago called Snowpiercer, which I really enjoyed. This new movie that he came out, yes, like I said, Netflix produced it. It's called Okja. OKJA. I just got through watching it a week or so ago. On Netflix, and it's about a young girl who has this very unusual pet, who's part of this multinational company's push to create the ultimate food source, and so it's got this kind of Old Yeller feel to it because it's her pet, or maybe not Old Yeller, but what's the one about the pig? Charlotte's Web.
Oh, Charlotte's Web.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You get attached to the thing that has to die at the end, sort of thing.
Okay.
So it's kind of it's got that feel like it's a kid's movie. It's not necessarily be a kid's movie, depending on how old your kid is, because it has some very serious themes to it and situations. But I just thought it was great. All right. I started to do Snowpiercer, but I wanted to do something which you know how I feel about that. That was just wonderful.
Well, yes. For if you're listening to this and you don't know Brian very well, Snowpiercer is we have had many long discussions about Snowpiercer in the past, and so maybe that will be a future one.
Sure. But I think that this director is he also wrote it. Where he's part of writing the screenplay. I just think it's great. He's just really, really good at what he does, telling a story. And this is a great example of it. And it's got a lot of VFX in it that's just stellar. So if we get that as an element we're going to discuss, we're going to have a lot of fun with that. I think we can have a lot of fun with the story itself and the characters. Tilda Swinton's in it. Who else is in it? Paul Dano. I'm just reading off the IMDb.
Yeah.
Yep, Jake Gyllenhaal's in it. Just really, really great story.
All right. Well, we can. I don't want to spoil everything talking about it all this time. Now we can. I'm looking forward to that. Are you ready to pick the category? What we're going to be talking about for that movie?
Roll that category wheel.
All right, and the category is writing.
Writing. Oh, that'll be great.
We'll be talking about the writing. Was it Okja? OKJA?
Yeah. OKJA.
Is that how it's pronounced?
Yeah.
All right.
That's the
writing
the
on
name
Okja
of the little or the big sort of pig animal creature. Yeah.
All right. So if you want to learn more, you can go to our website at talkingpicturespodcast.com. You can find me on Twitter. I'm at Dan Lefebvre, DanLefeb. How can they get a hold of you, Brian?
You can get a hold of me on Twitter at BrianCollins16.
Very good. All right. Chat with you next time. Bye.